On July 15, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sent Adolf Hitler a letter. In it, he told the Führer that Germany would lose the war. He signed it with his name and his rank. 3 days later, someone tried to kill Hitler with a bomb. Most accounts of why Rommel died begin with the bomb. The Gestapo investigation, his name emerging from interrogation. The official version, he was connected to the July 20 assassination plot and Hitler had him killed for it. That version is incomplete. The memo existed before any conspiracy charge was made. It has always been in the archive. It has almost never been the story. The memo told Hitler that the military situation in the West was beyond recovery, that the troops were fighting with extraordinary courage against overwhelming material superiority, that the moment was approaching when the front would break. It ended with a direct demand: Hitler must draw the political consequences. Rommel was telling the Führer in writing on official Wehrmacht letterhead that Germany had lost and must negotiate peace. He put his name on it. He was 52 years old. He had spent 3 years fighting across North Africa and France. He had been awarded every decoration Germany could give. The regime had spent 3 years using his name and his image to tell Germany the war was being won. On July 15, 1944, he used that name to tell the regime the opposite. Hitler did not reply. On July 17, 2 days after the memo was delivered, Rommel's staff car was attacked by British aircraft on a road in Normandy. He was thrown through the windscreen, his skull fractured in 3 places. 3 days after that, a bomb went off in Hitler's conference room in East Prussia. Rommel was in a hospital bed. He could not have placed it. By the time the investigation reached his name, the memo was already filed. The official reason for what happened next was the bomb. The memo was not discussed. To understand what the memo meant, you have to go back 3 years to where the official story of Rommel began. February 1941, 2 German divisions arrived in North Africa with orders to hold the line against the British advance. Within 6 weeks, the British were retreating. Within 3 months, they were 400 miles back. The regime in Berlin had an unexpected victory and a name to put on it. The propaganda machine moved quickly. The Desert Fox, Germany's undefeatable commander. The newsreels ran his image every week. His face appeared on the front pages of every major German newspaper. Schoolchildren wrote essays about him. In August 1942, Winston Churchill told the House of Commons that Rommel was a great general. Churchill meant it as a warning to his own commanders. Goebbels put the quote in the file and ran it as a compliment. The regime had built a myth around him and attached it to the myth of the war itself. What that meant in practical terms was simple. His success was Germany's success. His name was proof that Germany was winning. The myth required the war to be winning. The war was not winning. El Alamein, November 1942. The Afrika Korps was outgunned, outsupplied, and outmaneuvered by a British force that had finally received the reinforcements it needed. The retreat began. It did not stop until North Africa was lost entirely in May 1943. The myth required an explanation. The official explanation was supply failure and Allied material superiority. The private record said something more direct. The letters to his wife document the shift precisely. The early letters from North Africa are confident, the language of a man who believes in what he is doing and where it is going. By late 1942, the language changes. The confidence is replaced by qualified assessments. By 1943, the questions are direct. He writes of the certainty of German defeat if the situation does not change. By the summer of 1944, he is writing about what Germany's defeat will mean for the country and for his family. The dates are on the letters. The progression is not subtle. In late 1943, he was given Army Group B, the defense of the Atlantic Wall, the fortification of the French coastline against the Allied invasion that professional military assessment agreed was coming. He toured the defenses. He found them inadequate. He argued that the armored reserves needed to be positioned near the beaches where they could counterattack within hours of a landing. The argument was overruled. The reserves were held back from the coast. The Allies came ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944. The armored reserves were not at the beaches. By the time they were released from Central Command, the Allied beachhead was established and expanding. Rommel wrote to his wife that evening, "The day went as I expected." The exact words are in the letter. He had expected this. He had been overruled on every recommendation designed to prevent it. Through June 1944, he watched the Allied beachhead consolidate. He requested additional reserves. The requests were delayed or denied. He requested permission to adjust the defensive line. The requests were overruled. By early July, the private assessment in his letters was unambiguous. The front in the West could not be held with the forces and the command structure available to him. Germany was losing the war in France. He decided to put it in writing to Hitler directly. The memo was composed at his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon on July 15, 1944. It went through proper military channels. It was addressed formally. It used the language of official military assessment. It was not a personal letter. It was not a private document. It was a field marshal using the formal mechanism available to him, the official military report delivered through the chain of command, to tell his supreme commander that the war was lost. The memo opened with a precise military assessment of the situation in Normandy, Allied air superiority making daylight movement of German forces impossible, supply lines under constant attack, reinforcements arriving too slowly and in insufficient numbers, the fighting capacity of the frontline divisions declining daily. Each point was documented, each point was accurate. Each point had been reported through the chain of command for weeks without result. Then the memo moved beyond military assessment. The troops are fighting heroically, but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. It is necessary to draw the appropriate conclusions from this situation. He was not asking Hitler for more resources. He was not requesting a change of tactical deployment. He was telling the Supreme Commander that the military situation required a political decision. Germany must negotiate. The war in the West must end. The memo reached Hitler's headquarters on July 15. Hitler was at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. He received it. It was filed. He did not reply, not that day, not the following day. 2 days later, Rommel was in a hospital in France with a fractured skull, and the memo was sitting in a file at the Wolf's Lair, unanswered, while Hitler's aides decided what to do with a document in which his most celebrated field marshal had told him the war was over. Rommel was unconscious when they brought him in. The skull had fractured in 3 places, his left cheekbone was broken, his left temple was damaged. He was transferred to a military hospital and then to Germany to recover. He was not present when the bomb went off on July 20. He was not in contact with the conspirators on that day. He was in a hospital bed. What happened next was determined not by what he did on July 20, but by what he had written on July 15. The bomb had been placed by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg in a briefcase under the conference table. It detonated at 12:42. 4 men were killed. Hitler survived because the briefcase had been moved and because the conference was being held in a wooden building rather than the underground bunker where the blast would have been contained. The investigation began within hours. It was the most comprehensive Gestapo investigation of the war. The Gestapo worked through the networks methodically. Each arrest produced names, each name produced connections, each connection produced more arrests. Within days, the investigation had reached into the senior officer corps across multiple fronts. The conspirators had been more numerous than anyone outside the network had known. The chains of connection ran deep. One of those chains led to Caesar von Hoffacker, a Luftwaffe colonel, a key coordinator between the Berlin conspirators and the military command in France. He was arrested on July 25. He was interrogated under torture. His testimony is documented in the Gestapo records at the Bundesarchiv. Under that interrogation, he named Rommel. He stated that Rommel had been informed of the plot and had given his conditional support. He gave the investigators a specific sentence. "Tell your friends in Berlin they can count on me." That was the sentence Hoffacker gave under interrogation. He attributed it to Rommel directly, spoken at a meeting at La Roche-Guyon on June 17, 1944, 5 weeks before the bomb. The Gestapo recorded it. The sentence placed Rommel inside the conspiracy's network in the most direct possible terms. It also came from a man being tortured. Both things are true. Rommel was in Herrlingen recovering from his injuries. He was not formally told he was under investigation. He was not formally placed under arrest. He was a field marshal in a hospital recovering from wounds sustained in active service. But his correspondence was being monitored. Visitors were noted. Officers who had known him were being arrested. He had been in Herrlingen since August. He understood what was happening. He was still the man who had sent the memo. The memo that had arrived at Hitler's headquarters on July 15 and sat unanswered while events moved around it. The memo that told the Supreme Commander the war was lost. The conspiracy charge gave the regime a usable public reason. The memo had already provided a private one. He had not changed. The situation around him had. Hitler's problem had 2 components. The first was the conspiracy charge, provable enough through Hoffacker's testimony to justify action, but contested enough to make a public trial complicated. The second was the memo. A public trial would require the memo to be addressed. The field marshal's written assessment that Germany was losing the war, delivered formally 3 days before the assassination attempt, could not be entered into evidence in a show trial without confirming what the memo said. The regime had used his name for 3 years to tell Germany the war was being won. Putting him in the people's court meant putting his name on the official record as a traitor. Every German who had read his name in a newspaper, who had seen his face on a newsreel, who had believed the myth the regime had built around him, all of them would learn that the desert fox had turned against the cause. The propaganda investment of 3 years would be publicly destroyed. On the evening of October 13, 1944, Rommel received a telephone call from Berlin. The call informed him that 2 generals would arrive the following day to discuss his future. He had been waiting for a communication of this kind for weeks. He told his wife after the call he did not sleep. In the morning he made breakfast with his son. Generals Bergdorf and Mazel arrived at noon on October 14. They presented 3 options: the People's Court, a posting to the Eastern Front understood by everyone as a different kind of death sentence, or the poison they had brought with them. If he took the poison, his family would be protected, his staff would be left alone, and Germany would be told he had died of his wounds. He had 15 minutes to decide. He chose the poison. He said goodbye to his son upstairs. He put on his leather jacket. He checked that the 2 generals were waiting at the gate. He got in the car. He did not turn his head as it drove away. The car stopped a few hundred meters from the house at the edge of a forest. 20 minutes after the car left Herrlingen, the telephone rang at the house. The official cause of death was cerebral damage following the July strafing attack, heart failure. The state funeral was held 4 days later in Ulm. Hitler sent a wreath. Field Marshal von Rundstedt gave the eulogy and called him a soldier without equal. Von Rundstedt had not been told the actual cause of death. He believed what he was saying. The memo was not mentioned. The memo was filed. Every German newspaper ran the obituary. Every obituary described a hero of the Reich who had served to the last. Not one mentioned a memo dated July 15. Not one mentioned a field marshal telling Hitler in writing that Germany had lost. The regime had spent 3 years building the myth. The myth required a clean death. The memo required silence. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied investigators worked through the captured files at Hitler's headquarters. The Wolf's Lair had been evacuated and partially destroyed in January 1945 as the Soviet advance reached East Prussia. Not all documents survived. Some had been deliberately burned, some had been buried, some had simply been left in the buildings when the staff fled. Among the documents that survived was the memo, July 15, 1944, Rommel's signature at the bottom, his assessment of the military situation in the West, his demand that Hitler draw the political consequences. Filed in the unanswered correspondence. It had been in the file from the day it arrived until the day the war ended. Hitler had read it or had not read it. He had not replied either way. The memo is in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg. It has been there since the captured German military records were catalogued and transferred after the war. Historians who have worked with the Rommel papers have seen it. It appears in academic footnotes. It does not appear in the popular history of why Rommel died. The popular history begins with the bomb. The memo predates the bomb by 3 days. The officers who were publicly tried did not have the protection Rommel's name gave him. Field Marshal von Witzleben was brought to the People's Court in August 1944. The presiding judge denied him the right to speak in his own defense. He was hanged at Plötzensee prison on thin wire from a steel hook. The footage was sent to Hitler. The People's Court processed 200 conspirators. Rommel was not among them. The regime needed a different arrangement. The arrangement required Rommel's cooperation with the terms of his own death. The cooperation was secured by the guarantee, family protected, staff left alone, state funeral, clean obituary. The guarantee was kept. His widow and his son maintained the official account through the remaining months of the war. Manfred was 15 years old. He kept the silence his father had asked for. The regime collapsed 7 months after October 14. The cover story it had constructed did not survive contact with the people who had been inside the house. Manfred's account of that morning was documented by Allied investigators in 1945. The memo was found in the captured files the same year. The 2 documents, his son's testimony and the field marshal's final official letter, came to light at the same time. July 15, 1944. The date on the memo is 3 days before the bomb. The Gestapo investigation that produced Hoffecker's testimony did not begin until July 20. The conspiracy charge against Rommel did not exist until after the bomb. The memo existed before all of it. A field marshal who had told Hitler in writing that the war was lost was always going to be a problem for a regime that needed the war to continue. The bomb gave the problem a solution that required no public explanation. His grave is in Herrlingen, the memo is in Freiburg. Both have been there since 1945. The official account that ran in every German newspaper in October 1944, wounds, heart failure, a natural death in service, has been corrected in the historical record. The correction does not always mention July 15. The bomb is easier to explain. The memo requires a different question to be asked. The question is not whether Rommel was involved in the July 20 conspiracy. Historians continue to debate the exact nature of his connection. The question is what would have happened if the bomb had not gone off. If July 20 had been an ordinary Wednesday in 1944, the memo would still have been in the file, unanswered, signed, a field marshal telling Hitler in writing that Germany had lost. The regime would still have had to decide what to do with it. The memo is not a secret, it is not classified, it is accessible to anyone with credentials to work in the Bundesarchiv. It has been there for 80 years. What it represents, a professional soldier using the last available formal mechanism to tell his supreme commander the truth about the war, was always going to be more dangerous to the regime than any bomb. A bomb that fails can be explained away. A document with your most celebrated general's signature on it telling you the war is lost cannot be unfiled. He put his name on it, that is the fact that sits at the center of everything that followed, not the conspiracy, not the interrogation, not Hofecker's testimony under torture. A field marshal who had spent 3 years as the face of Germany's military success put his name on a document telling Hitler the war was lost and submitted it through official channels. The regime spent 3 months deciding what to do with that signature. On October 14, it sent 2 men to Herrlingen with an answer. His widow maintained the official account for the remainder of the war. She understood what the alternative meant. After Germany's surrender, she contacted Allied investigators directly. She confirmed what Manfred had already told them. She confirmed the phone call the night before, the breakfast, the walk in the garden, the generals at the door, what was said upstairs, what was said at the gate. The Allied investigators cross-referenced the testimony against the captured documents, the memo, the Gestapo investigation files, the correspondence between Hitler's headquarters and the generals sent to Herrlingen. The timeline assembled from the documents was precise. Memo delivered July 15, no reply, strafing attack July 17, bomb July 20, investigation reaches Rommel by September, generals arrive October 14. The memo was the beginning of the timeline, not the bomb. B.H. Lidl-Hart interviewed German generals extensively after the war for what became the Rommel Papers, published in 1953. The interviews documented what those generals knew, what they had been told, and what they had observed. The picture that emerged from the interviews was consistent with the documents. Rommel had reached his conclusion about the war privately before the conspiracy gave the regime its public reason. The memo was the private conclusion made official. The Rommel papers were edited by Lidl-Hart from the family's documents, the letters to Lucy, the notes and drafts Rommel had kept. The book is the closest available record of his private thinking across the war years. Read in sequence from the confident early letters to the qualified assessments of 1943 to the direct language of 1944. The July 15 memo is not a surprise. It is the formal version of what the private letters had been saying for months. He had been arriving at that conclusion for a long time. July 15 was when he signed it. The memo is in Freiburg. It has been there since the captured German military records were catalogued and transferred after the war. It is available to researchers. It is cited in the academic literature. It is almost entirely absent from the accessible documentary record of why Rommel died. The accessible record begins with the bomb because the bomb is the dramatic event. The memo predates the bomb. The memo is the reason the bomb mattered. What the memo represented to the regime was not treason in the legal sense the People's Court would have prosecuted. It was something more specific and in some ways more dangerous. It was the most credible possible voice, the face of Germany's military success, the name the regime had spent 3 years making synonymous with German victory, putting his signature on a document that said the victory was not coming. In October 1944, that signature was worth more to the Allies as propaganda than any bomb could have been. Manfred was 15 years old when he watched the car turn the corner and disappear. He kept the silence his father had asked for through the remaining 7 months of the war. He was a teenager maintaining a secret that the regime had made his responsibility. The secret was not the conspiracy. The conspiracy was contested. The secret was simpler. His father had told Hitler the war was lost, had put his name on it, and had been killed for it. Manfred Rommel lived until 2013. He became mayor of Stuttgart. He gave interviews about his father throughout his life. He described October 14 in detail in every account he gave: the breakfast, the walk in the garden, the generals, the bedroom, the specific words. He also described July 15 when he was asked about it. His father had shown him the memo before sending it. He had told his son, "I have written what I believe to be true. If it costs me my command, so be it." It did not cost him his command. He was in a hospital bed 2 days later. It cost him something the memo did not anticipate and could not have prevented. The regime that received the memo was not capable of the response the memo assumed was possible: a rational military and political authority capable of acting on an accurate professional assessment. That regime had been dismantled between 1934 and 1941. What remained was not capable of drawing the political consequences. It was only capable of eliminating the man who had asked it to. July 15, 1944, 3 days before the bomb, 89 days before the car stopped at the edge of the forest in Herrlingen. The memo sits in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg. It has his name on it. It says Germany will lose the war. Germany lost the war. The official account of why he died begins on July 20. The document that explains why begins 3 days earlier. The grave is in Herrlingen, a few hundred meters from the forest where the car stopped. The memo is in Freiburg. Both have been in those places for 80 years. One of them is easy to find. The other requires knowing what question to ask.